A suspension of mercy. (16) By Saturday, August 6th, the police had come a second time to Sidney's house and also to Mrs. Lilybank's, the same young constable, plus an older man in plain clothes from Ipswich, Inspector Brockway. He was a tall, rugged man of about 50 who spoke softly but coughed every few minutes very loudly. By the first Saturday in August, it had dawned on Sidney that Alicia was playing her part too, and with determination, in a make-believe drama in which he had done away with her. She was not going to be heard from by him or anyone else, if she could help it. And Saturday, Sidney felt suspicion emanating from Inspector Brockway. Curiously, Sidney felt a bit guilty and nervous. Yet he also felt quite sure of himself because he hadn't done away with her. However, he quite genuinely dropped a cup in the kitchen as he was pouring a cup of coffee for himself. The inspector and the constable had declined coffee, and both men had been watching from the dining room at the time. He stammered. He said first that he had put his wife on the train at Campsie Ash. Then, as the young constable corrected him on the basis of his first statement, Sidney changed it to Ipswich. "Did you see anyone you knew that day at Ipswich? Anyone at the station?" asked the inspector. "Unfortunately, no," Sidney had answered quickly, and he saw the inspector catch the word unfortunately. It was astonishing how naturally all the imaginary guilt came out. The inspector asked to see Alicia's room upstairs, which meant the bedroom and her studio, and Sidney remarked that she had taken her paint box, the size of a small suitcase, but not her easel. The inspector slid out the top drawer, which was Alicia's, in the chest of drawers in the bedroom, perhaps looking for something no woman would have left behind, like a lipstick or a compact. But the drawer contained 4 lipsticks, and 2 old compacts still, besides a stack of handkerchiefs and scarves, manicure scissors, a small sewing kit, and several belts. Inspector Brockway asked what kind of suitcase she had taken, and Sidney told him 2, a navy blue one with brown leather corners and a larger brown leather one with a strap. She had taken some winter suits and a cloth coat with fur collar. What had she been wearing? Sidney couldn't remember, but she had carried her tan raincoat over her arm. Then Inspector Brockway and the young constable walked out the back door without saying anything, and Sidney trailed after them, puzzled, until it occurred to him that the inspector wanted to see if the backyard and garden showed any signs of digging. Sidney was somewhat interested, as it reminded him of Christie, and he did his best to imagine himself really guilty of having killed and buried his wife under a couple of square yards of grass, which he would have carefully replaced after cutting it up into 6-inch square divots. But he couldn't really imagine much internally, and as for externally, he supposed a guilty man would have done the same as he, looked up at the sky and the birds, and let the police be. A guilty man would, of course, have kept a lookout for what the police might be finding, and Sidney had done this, casting a glance now and then from his distance of some 40 feet. The inspector had looked at the garage also, and noted that it had a wooden floor. It certainly wasn't a thorough search, Sidney thought. A proper investigation would have meant going on hands and knees over every foot of the place, poking and even digging in spots, and tearing up the garage floorboards. But still, that was what the inspector's look-around was for, a buried corpse, and closer inspection might come later. The 2 or 3 rains in the last month would have obliterated any signs of freshly turned earth since Alicia had been gone, and no doubt the inspector was thinking this too. The inspector's goodbye, courteous but stiff, was without any cheery word about keeping his chin up or any promise to ring him as soon as they found out anything. Sidney lit a cigarette and watched the 2 officers walking toward Mrs. Lilybank's house. The inspector's car was at the edge of the road in front of Sidney's house. Mrs. Lilybank's, he supposed, would put in a good word for him and counteract some of the suspicion he had raised in the inspector's mind. On the other hand, the inspector might hint at his suspicion and plant some in her mind. They'd be trying to get all they could out of Mrs. Lilybank's naturally. She might mention the carpet, if she had seen it. Sidney wished very much that he could listen in on the conversation. Several hours later, around 5 p.m., Mrs. Lilybanks telephoned and asked Sidney if it would be convenient if she came over for a minute, or perhaps he would like to come to her and have a cup of tea or a drink. "Either way, why don't you come here?" Sidney said. "I have both those things too." Mrs. Lillibanks said she would come over, but it took her nearly 10 minutes to get out of the house. She glanced at herself 2 or 3 times in the mirror to be sure she hadn't any paint smudges on her face, as she had just been painting, or trying to. The visit from the Ipswich inspector had shaken her terribly. She had taken a spoonful of the medicine that Dr. Underwood had told her to take only when she really felt fluttery, and then she had lain down for an hour, though without sleeping. "We are obliged to consider the possibility that Mr. Bartleby may have killed his wife, Mrs. Lillibanks." Then he went on, qualifying it, minimising it. But the words had made Mrs. Lillibanks realise that she had a faint suspicion too. It was possible. That was the awful thing. Then she realised that she had one way of finding out, if she had the courage. Courage it would take, but the doubt she felt now would be worse to live with, she thought. Doubt in a thing like this was like a horrible pain itself, and this was not something she could pass on to Inspector Brockway, because if she did, he'd attach perhaps too much importance to it. Sidney might be quite innocent. At last, Mrs. Lillibanks set out and knocked on the Bartlebys' front door at 5:15, and at the same moment she remembered, uncomfortably, Alex Polk Faraday's telephone call of 2 days ago that had been essentially to find out what she thought about Alicia's being gone, and about Sidney. Yes, Mr. Polk Faraday's mind had been quite ready for any suggestion of guilt she might have offered, and since he was supposed to be a friend and a partner of Sidney, Mrs. Lillibanks hadn't liked that in him at all. Sidney swung the door open and greeted her with a smile. "How are you, Sidney?" "Oh, more police calls today. I saw they came to you too, but no news, I'm afraid." "No, I'm sorry, Sidney." "I suppose she's lying low, willing to stand the publicity to keep her seclusion, wherever she is. Her parents are going to be sore when she gets back. They're very proper people. Sit down, Mrs. Lillibanks. Can I get you a scotch, or would you prefer tea?" "Neither, thanks." "Neither?" he said, disappointed. "I really came over," she said, turning a little from him, looking down at the rug under her feet, "to ask you where you bought this carpet. I need a carpet in my house. I wondered if you know a good place." Sidney's face looked startled for an instant. Then he said, "I got it at Abbott's in Debenham. They had a few Orientals like this, not many, but you might give it a try. This was only £8, I think." Mrs. Lillibanks sat down slowly on the sofa, watching Sidney. "I really quite liked the old one you had here. I'd buy that from you," she said, forcing a chuckle. "But we haven't got it. I took it." He smiled. "I took that old carpet out and dumped it. We didn't want to give it house room, and I doubt if anyone would have given 10 shillings for it." Mrs. Lillibanks heard her heart pounding under her green coat sweater. Sidney had turned a little pale, she thought. He looked guilty. He acted guilty. Yet her unwillingness to believe he was guilty was keeping her from labelling him guilty definitely. Now he was watching her carefully. "Well, it's no matter," Mrs. Lillibanks said. "I'll try Abbott's. I know it's very popular with everyone in the neighbourhood." "Well, Sidney, I mustn't keep you," she said, getting up. "You're probably still working." "Oh, I work off and on all the time," he said more cheerfully. "No fixed schedule. Interruptions don't bother me. In fact, I get a little lonely sometimes and enjoy an interruption." Now was the time to ask him for dinner tonight, and let him see the binoculars, Mrs. Lillibanks thought. Talk to him about bird-watching in the early hours, and see his reaction to that, but she was simply not up to it. Not tonight. "You must come again for dinner soon," she said. She went to the door and turned. "I pray that Alicia's all right, Sidney, wherever she is. And do let me know, won't you, if—" He was still watching her warily. "Oh, of course, Mrs. Lillibanks, if I hear from her. You bet I will." She went slowly back to her own house. It was strange, she thought, that he hadn't asked her what the police had talked to her about. Wouldn't anybody have wanted to know? Anybody who wasn't guilty? Sidney at that moment was daydreaming over Alex's final script of The Second Sequentin, which had come in the Morning Post. A very fast job on Alex's part. Mrs. Lillybanks had seen him, with the old carpet on his shoulder. His silly pantomime for corpse removal that morning had actually had an audience of one. And how did he feel? A little guilty, to be sure, as if the play-acting of other people had convinced him of the validity of their suspicions, not his own play-acting. The telephone rang. Sidney ran down to answer it, thinking it might be a London friend calling to report a police visit. Today, Inspector Brockway had asked him for the names of Alicia's closest friends, and he had given Inez and Carpy, the Polk Faradays, and a couple of the school friends whose names he had looked up in the address book, the only address book they had between them, the inspector had ascertained, and which Alicia had not taken. "Hello, you scheming murderer," a sinister voice said. Sidney laughed. "Hello, Alex. I'm a happy scheming murderer, thank you. I'm just looking over your synopsis. Came in the afternoon post. Very nice." Sidney waited. This was about the whip's assassination of an incipient dictator. "The police called on me a few minutes ago," Alex said. "Good God, man, what have you been telling them down there? Or acting like?" "What do you mean?" "They act as if they suspect you of doing away with Alicia. What have you been doing? Kidding them? That can be dangerous, you know. They were asking me about your character. You don't want me to tell 'em the truth, do you?" "I hope you made it properly black, befitting the creator of the whip." "I said you were a highly suspicious character, addicted to wife-beating, had a morbid imagination, were fond of making up sinister words to songs, and obviously you'd persuaded your young, rich wife to take a house in the country in a lonely spot, Roncinol, so you could do her in and bury her in the woods somewhere." Alex gave his falsetto laugh. "Aha, aha, aha!" which he gave only when he was genuinely amused, and which sounded like an American take-off of an Englishman's laugh. Sidney smiled. "What did they really ask you?" "Well, dear Sidney, I'm not far off the mark. They asked me how I thought you and Alicia were getting along. I said I thought quite well. Asked me if I thought Alicia were possibly seeing another man. I said I certainly didn't think so. Do you?" "No. No, I don't," Sidney said. But he did think it was possible. Alicia would have been most discreet, of course, and never have given him a hint. "You haven't heard anything, have you? About any man in London?" "Not a word, no. Not a breath of scandal. Of course, you know she's 6 feet under in the woods near here, so I don't know why I'm wasting my breath talking about boyfriends." "How did you kill her, Bartleby? You know everything's up now. You may as well come clean." "Pushed her down the stairs, broke her neck. Then I buried her the next morning before dawn. Never felt better in my life. I'm glad I did it. I'd do it again if I could." "Thank you, Mr. Bartleby. I know our audience has enjoyed your first-hand, straight-from-the-killer's-mouth comments on a sport millions of us would like to take up, if we could afford it." Pips sounded on his last words, and he said hastily, "Back to the whip for both of us. Let's clinch this thing." They hung up. By 10 o'clock, Sidney had finished his fine-toothed comb reading of the second sequenton and put it into a manila envelope, not yet sealed, for posting tomorrow. He wondered what Alicia was doing at this moment, and why hadn't he heard from the Sneesums in the last 4 days? He looked up Inez's and Carpy's number in the address book and called them. Carpy answered. Inez was out, and Carpy was staying in with the kids. "No news, Sid, I gather," she said in her resonant West Indian voice, with an English accent. "No news, no. The police came by today. Inez was here. They came by just before 6. I had to give them your names, Carpy. They were interested in knowing who Alicia's London friends are. I hope you didn't mind." "Oh, of course not, Sid. But they were asking some very funny questions about you, we thought. Were you and Alicia happily married, and had we ever seen you quarrelling? Naturally, we said no. I said you were a couple of artists and liked to be alone now and then. Asked us if we thought Alicia was seeing some other man. We said we didn't think so. You don't think so, do you, Sid?" "No," Sidney said. "I hope they're not going to natter you, just because they haven't anyone else." "If they do, I can't blame them. They've got a job to do." "Very true, but it's a nasty way of doing it. Don't ever lose your temper with them, Sid. It'll make things that much worse." "I'm perfectly good-tempered with them." Then Sidney made the usual promise to ring in case he heard any news. Sidney thought, as he was getting ready for bed, that it was very strange to be friends with an accuser who could not prove, Alex, and someone who could prove but would not accuse, Mrs. Lilybanks. It was like being punished and exonerated at the same time. He might make a story out of that. And he jotted the thought down in his notebook. 17. Mrs. Lilybanks stood at her dining-room table, slowly putting flowers into an orange and white bowl that had sockets for stems at the bottom. It was 4:15, and Mrs. Hawkins was upstairs cleaning the bathroom, which she always did last. The house looked especially nice, as all the furniture had had a polishing today. Sydney was coming for dinner at 7:30. Mrs. Lilybanks went into the kitchen to start the tea water for Mrs. Hawkins and herself. Mrs. Hawkins was a middle-sized, lean woman of 50, with unruly grey hair that stuck out from her black braid and bun. She had alert grey eyes, a lumpy nose, and a vaguely anxious manner. Not a soothing person to be around, but she was extremely dependable, and had never missed coming to Mrs. Lilybanks's house when she said she would, though her cleaning days had to vary because of her own family's demands. She did not come every day now, as she had when Mrs. Lilybanks had moved in, because Mrs. Lilybanks had said it wasn't necessary. The daily visit had been an idea of Dr. Underwood in London, seconded by Mrs. Lilybanks' granddaughter, Prissy, who had spoken to Mrs. Hawkins when Mrs. Lilybanks had moved in. But Mrs. Hawkins did ring up every day, between 3 and 4 p.m, to see if she was all right. Every day since the news of Alicia's disappearance had been in the papers, Mrs. Hawkins had asked if Mrs. Lilybanks had heard anything, and she was one of many in the neighbourhood who suspected Sydney of foul play of some kind, possibly even of murder, because Mrs. Hawkins, like everyone else, had found out through the newspapers that Sydney had known for weeks that his wife wasn't at her parents' house, and hadn't told even his and his wife's best friends. "That shows he was up to something," Mrs. Hawkins said several times to Mrs. Lilybanks, and Mrs. Lilybanks let it go by as best she could, knowing the hopelessness of explaining to someone like Mrs. Hawkins that Alicia and Sydney, being painter and writer, might enjoy a vacation from each other for a while, one not knowing where the other was. But after the carpet conversation with Sydney, Mrs. Hawkins, "That shows he was up to something," began to eat into Mrs. Lilybanks' defences, and she felt exhausted with trying to protect Sydney, and felt, moreover, that the common sense of simple people like Mrs. Hawkins and Mr. Fowler and Mr. Veery the butcher might be right, and her rationalisations wrong. But Mrs. Lilybanks gave no sign to Mrs. Hawkins that she was beginning to agree with her. They had tea in the dining-room at the table where the flower bowl stood. "No news. Well, well," Mrs. Hawkins said, shaking her head, stirring her tea. She had found that out 2 hours before when she had arrived. Mrs. Lilybanks felt irked, and also tongue-tied by the subject. Mrs. Hawkins would have a fit if she knew Sydney Bartleby was coming for dinner, and she hoped Mrs. Hawkins would not find out. But all it would take would be Rutledge driving past in his banged-up hauler and seeing Sydney enter her house at 7:30. Mr. Fowler would know the next morning, and so would everyone else. "He looks so pleased with himself," Mrs. Hawkins went on. "Sort of a smile on his face whenever you see him. Not like a man who's worried about his wife. Oh, no. I don't think he is worried, Mrs. Hawkins. I knew Alicia slightly, you know." Mrs. Lilybanks realised she had used the past tense. "She likes to go off by herself now and then. Americans are violent. Everyone knows that. I say, when are they going to prove anything? The police should be digging around his house, like the Christie case, not waiting till a grave grows so old they can't find it. Is that window too chilly on you, Mrs. Lilybanks?" she asked, meaning the kitchen window. No, thank you. I raised it because I was using a good bit of ammonia in there this afternoon. Never liked the smell of ammonia." She smiled with sudden cheer. A few moments later she was gone, promising to come again on Saturday, 2 days from now, and to telephone tomorrow as usual. "I hope you're keeping your doors well locked at night, Mrs. Lilybanks. I don't envy you living here, and neither does anybody else." The words lingered unpleasantly in Mrs. Lilybanks' ears. She went upstairs and, solemnly, with a feeling of ceremoniousness, got the binoculars from the top drawer of her bureau, carried them downstairs and put them on a corner of the sideboard in the dining-room. Her eyes were drawn to an innocent-looking sparrow that alighted on the window-sill, looked her in the eye for an instant, then flew off again. Mrs. Lillybanks went upstairs to rest for a while before she came down and started her dinner. Rap, 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 sounded on Mrs. Lillybanks' front door at 7:35. She went to open it. "Greetings, Mrs. Lillybanks," Sidney said. "I bring some coals to Newcastle. Ipswich is best." He handed her a bunch of long-stemmed red gladioli, wrapped in tissue paper. "Why, thank you, Sidney. How nice. And this, for tonight or for the future." He presented a bottle of red wine, wrapped in purple tissue from the liquor shop. "Well, what's the occasion? Have you—" She couldn't ask if he had heard from Alicia. "Mr. Plummer of ITV likes the whip a little more today. Hasn't bought it yet, but he likes our first 3 stories, and I'm rather optimistic, and so is Alex. Mrs. Lillybanks, you'll have to get a television set to see my masterpieces of flumdubbery. I'll buy you one." Sidney waved a hand airily. "No, you won't. I have been thinking of getting one before the winter. Sidney, that's marvellous. I do hope it works out. I know how you've laboured over that." Sidney stood on tiptoe, sniffing. He was wearing his best shoes, and he had given them a shine. "What's that celestial smell emanating from yon humble country kitchen? Duck. I hope you like duck. Just let me put these in water, and I'll make you a drink. No, you come and make yourself a drink." "With pleasure." He followed her through the dining room and into the kitchen. They stayed nearly 5 minutes in the kitchen while Mrs. Lillybanks put the gladioli into a tall vase, and Sidney made himself a scotch and water with ice and a scotch and water without ice for Mrs. Lillybanks. They chatted, but Mrs. Lillybanks found herself a bit strained because she couldn't or didn't want to say things like, "What a pity you can't ring Alicia up somewhere and tell her about the whip." They carried their drinks across the dining room toward the living room. Mrs. Lillybanks turned before she entered the living room, turned deliberately, and her right hand tightened and trembled on her glass at what she saw. Sidney had stopped, with one foot extended for a step, and was staring at the binoculars, his lips slightly parted as they had parted when she mentioned the old carpet. He saw her looking at him. "Oh, those binoculars." He rubbed his forehead quickly with his fingertips. "Yes. You got them in Ipswich, didn't you?" He advanced slowly toward her, and she went on into the living room. "At that second-hand shop?" "Yes," Mrs. Lillybanks said. "I bought them for bird watching. I started to buy them myself. That's why I was looking at them. One day I went to the shop. I'd seen them once before, and they weren't in the window. I was disappointed. That's why they gave me such a turn just now. It's like seeing something I thought I owned." Mrs. Lillybanks sat down on the sofa. Sidney looked too restless to sit down. She did not ask him to. "I watch birds sometimes in the early morning, around dawn." Again he looked at her warily, waiting for what she might say. "He's pretending all of this," Mrs. Lillybanks thought suddenly. "He'll probably put it in one of his stories. But what had been in the carpet that made it so heavy, and why had he carried it out before dawn? Neither of the Bartlebys liked to get up very early, not that early. Alicia had once said so. Why had Sidney been up so early, the very day after Alicia left? "Did you see in the paper today that Frenchman made it in his boat? A 12-foot boat from Marseille to Tangier?" Sidney asked. And they talked of other things throughout dinner. Mrs. Lillybanks knew exactly what she ought to say if she pursued the matter. It was only a question of courage, she felt. And why shouldn't she show some? Suppose Sidney got suddenly angry and struck her dead. She did not know from one week to the next when she might die. If Sidney did her harm, it would at least serve the purpose of proving his guilt. If he had killed Alicia, it was horrible, and it must be brought out into the open. Mrs. Lillybanks approached the task with a weary resignation and a curious gloom, as she had approached the matter of dying some 6 months before, when her doctor told her she might have only 2 more years in which to live. "I saw you one morning early," Mrs. Lillybanks began pleasantly, as they were having their coffee, "through the binoculars. I think it was the morning you were disposing of your old carpet. You had something heavy over your shoulder. Yes? Oh, yes, Sidney said, and his cup clattered as he replaced it in his saucer. That was the carpet. The trembling was real, Mrs. Lillybanks saw. No one could pretend this well, and Sidney was obviously trying to control himself. A start of fear tingled along Mrs. Lillybanks' spine, then disappeared, the kind of tingle that might come from seeing a ghost. I was surprised to see you up that early. I often am, though. It was the morning after Alicia left, because I remember looking around for Alicia too, then remembering she'd left the day before. Oh, that day, Sidney said. She saw his underlip come out. In stubbornness, or was it a sign of defeat, that the game was up? And he stared at the centre of the table. She wished desperately that he would say something. What did you do with the carpet? She asked, still in a pleasant tone. Oh, I got rid of it. Completely, Sidney said just as pleasantly. You buried it, Mrs. Lillybanks said, with a try at a smile. Yes. Now there was a glint in his eyes like madness, as if he meant to reach across the table and strike her. Then just as suddenly it went away. Yes, I thought the thing had some moths in it, so it was just as well to bury it, or burn it, but I didn't want people to think the forest was on fire. You buried it in a forest? No, just out in the country. He waved a hand vaguely. Is that why you got up so early? So you wouldn't be seen? Mrs. Lillybanks sat stiffly now. Her heart had stepped up its beats. She put out her half-finished cigarette and decided to have not a drop more coffee. I suppose so, Sidney said, watching her. What was in the carpet? Sidney's right hand was clenched beside his cup and saucer, his thumb tucked into his fist. He was going to break out in a cold sweat in a moment, she thought, or burst out in a fury and strike her. You seem to be accusing me, like Alex and Mrs. Hawkins and Mr. Fowler and all the rest, like the police. His voice was not loud, but it shook. I'm not accusing you of anything. Really, I am asking. You think I killed Alicia and carried her body out in the carpet and buried her. You're trying to prove it. I'm not trying to prove anything. Yes, you are. Testing me, offering to buy the old carpet when you'd seen me carrying it out of the house. She didn't need to test him, she thought. Here was proof enough. She felt anything but triumphant. She could have collapsed gratefully on the table, laid her head down, disappeared. If you tell me there was nothing in the carpet, then I'll believe you, and I do not intend to tell anyone that I saw you with the carpet, not the neighbours and not the police. He still looked at her in a frightened way. I'm not sure I believe that. You should. I could have told the police last week, that I saw you carrying a carpet to your car, driving away with it, but I didn't. Why? Mrs. Lillybanks didn't want to say, because she hadn't been sure it was important until now. If you are guilty of anything, it will come out. I leave it to you, Sidney, entirely. Now she saw the perspiration on his forehead. He continued to stare at her. I have some brandy in the house. Would you like some? Yes. Yes, please. She was relieved that he accepted it, that he had answered politely. It was the brandy she kept for herself as medicine, but she had not taken any since she had moved into the cottage. She brought a large stemmed glass and gave Sidney a good measure. He began to sip it, leaning a little over the table. Some more coffee, Mrs. Lillybanks said, pouring some from the silver pot into Sidney's cup. This can't go on like this, Sidney said, as if to himself. What can't? You're not saying that you saw anything. She tried to look at him calmly. You don't know me well, perhaps. I can keep my promises. This is a promise to myself, not to you. It's not my business to bring suspicion against anyone, Sidney, especially suspicion that may be false." He was calming down. Perhaps the brandy was helping. He even started talking about television sets, about Suffolk being good for reception because it was flat. But he was ill at ease, and he looked at her with a different eye. "Prissy's coming down this weekend," Mrs. Lillybanks said. "You must meet her this time. I'm sorry you missed her the last time." She had been waiting for an opportunity to say that. The most mitigating thing she could possibly say, she thought, for what person would introduce a young granddaughter to someone she thought was a murderer? "I'd like to," Sidney replied. He smoked only part of a cigarette in the living room, and then took his leave, without offering to help her with the dishes as he had on other occasions. Mrs. Lillybanks sat on the sofa for several minutes, trying to collect herself. She had endangered herself, certainly, but perhaps the danger point was past now. Sidney knew now he was open to serious suspicion, and if he were guilty, Mrs. Lillybanks thought, his nervousness would be the thing that would betray him. That, and the pressure of guilt, in which she strongly believed. Most murderers had a great compulsion to confess, to be caught. She had started the ball rolling, as Sidney might say, so all in all she did not think she had done badly that evening. Furthermore, she had discovered something. She really believed Sidney had done away with Alicia. 18. The following morning Mrs. Sneesham telephoned Sidney and said that she and her husband would like to drop in and see him in the afternoon. Just that, brief and crisp. Sidney, of course, said he would be very glad to see them. They would arrive around 3 p.m., said Mrs. Sneesham. After they had hung up, Sidney wandered about the house straightening things, though the place looked quite presentable, he thought. Sidney did remove the newspaper photograph with balloon from the bathroom wall, which he realised Mrs. Lillybanks must have seen on the 1 or 2 occasions she had gone upstairs. He supposed the Sneeshams, if they were doing a good job of casing the place, might call on Mrs. Lillybanks too. Alicia must have told her mother a great deal about her. This was Saturday, Sidney realised, the day Mrs. Lillybanks' granddaughter Prissy would arrive. A busy day. Reluctantly, he left a whip synopsis he was stewing over and took the car to Roncy Knoll for some shopping. His synopsis was nearly done and needed only one more twist to complete it. In this story, his 5th, the whip assumed a feminine dress in order to impersonate a wealthy elderly woman who had been presumed dead. The whip managed to fool even the woman's husband, not to mention the lawyers, and got his hands on a great deal of cash and jewels before disappearing. It was a lively plot, full of laughs, and Sidney was ready to chalk up his 5th whip winner. He needed a title. Skirting the issue? Ugh. "Morning, Mr. Veery," Sidney said to the butcher. "Morning." Mr. Veery gave a glum nod, then proceeded to look at Sidney's face, his hands, his clothes, with a stunned expression, as if he might not hear Sidney's order when it came. "Any nice steaks today?" Sidney asked. Sidney bought 2 steaks and a half-pound of streaky bacon, and Mr. Veery handed him the package, then his change, as if fearful his fingertips might come in contact with Sidney's palm. A customer edged away as Sidney went to the door, yet stared at him all the while too. Sidney looked back through the window and saw Mr. Veery and the woman already in animated conversation. Mrs. Lillybanks rang and asked if he would come for strawberries and coffee with her and Prissy around 2:30 that afternoon. Sidney had noticed the red Triumph convertible, which had arrived while he was at the butcher's, in front of Mrs. Lillybanks' house. "Yes, thanks, I'd like to," Sidney said. "I can't stay long because Mr. and Mrs. Sneesham are coming at 3. Alicia's parents." His voice was as open and cheerful as if Thursday night had never happened. Mrs. Lillybanks sounded just as usual also. He supposed he had frightened Mrs. Lillybanks that night, but she had also frightened him. His pretending, which he had meant to be comical or amusing only to himself, had suddenly become real. No one could produce a cold sweat on the forehead just by trying to, Sidney thought. Not the greatest actor. Well, he knew what it felt like, all right, to be suspected of murder by a nice old lady. It felt awful, unspeakably embarrassing, shameful, bizarre, even mad. At 2:15 he finished his synopsis, then went over to Mrs. Lillybanks. Priscilla Holloway was what Sidney thought a knockout, a smallish, slender but well-rounded girl with long, straight brown hair, almond eyes, a smooth olive complexion, and a fantastic sex appeal that perhaps she, and probably Mrs. Lilybanks, was unaware of. Prissy affected an extremely calm and poised manner, perhaps because she was trying to look older and more sophisticated than she was, and also perhaps because Mrs. Lilybanks had told her something about him and about Alicia's disappearance. But Sidney did not think Mrs. Lilybanks had told her of her suspicions. Prissy looked at him as if she thought he were a man of mystery, but not a criminal. Alicia was not mentioned in the half-hour he spent with them. They talked about London, a play Prissy had a bit part in now called A Cup of Summer, and she asked Sidney about his television series which she had heard about from her grandmother. "Granny, you haven't shown me your paintings yet," Prissy said.
"Oh, I will, but not now, because Sidney can't stay very long, and he's seen most of them anyway."
"Yes, I must go," said Sidney, getting up. "You haven't met the Sneesums, have you, Mrs. Lilybanks?"
"No, I'd like to. Would you like to ask them over for some tea?"
"Oh, thanks. I was going to give them tea myself. I'll give you a ring later, and we'll see how things are." He looked at Mrs. Lilybanks in a frank, pleasant way. "Thanks so much for the strawberries. Nice to have met you, Miss Holloway." He left. The Sneesums were 10 minutes early. Looking at them as they got out of their grey Mercedes-Benz, Sidney thought they both looked older, that the strain of anxiety showed in both their faces. Mr. Sneesum was a smallish, slight man with thin red hair and a pale complexion. His wife was as tall, if not taller, blonde and a bit chinless, though with determined nose and eyes. Alicia was a luckily handsome combination of both of them.
"Hello, Sidney,"
Mrs. Sneesum said as she came through the gate, though without extending her hand.
"How are you?"
Sidney stood midway on the flagstones of the front walk. "Well enough, thank you. How are you?" They went into the house. Sidney offered them sherry, which they declined, then tea, which they also refused, saying it was a bit early. They both looked around the living room as if for clues to the mystery of Alicia's departure. For the next 5 minutes or so, Mrs. Sneesum went over the questions she had been asking Sidney for the past weeks on the telephone, but now Sidney realised that she was mainly interested in seeing his face as he gave his answers. Mr. Sneesum sat quietly, concentrating upon Sidney also, and looking like a smaller and more wizened effigy of Sinclair Lewis.
"You're sure she didn't change trains at Ipswich?" said Mrs. Sneesum. "Get off the one she was on and take another northbound, for instance?"
"I saw the train move off," Sidney replied. "We waved to each other." They hadn't waved, but he had seen the train move off. Mrs. Sneesum rested her cool, calculating grey eyes on him.
"Mm-hmm. The police have tried to find a railway official who remembered seeing Alicia getting on that morning, or—"
"Oh, that would be difficult, I suppose," Sidney interrupted with a smile.
"Yes. No one does remember."
Mrs. Sneesum glanced at her husband, who only looked glum and rubbed a forefinger along his nose. She sat up on the sofa and recrossed her slender legs. She wore a black and blue printed silk dress and gave off a scent of perfume Sidney could not identify, probably because its costliness was out of the range of his acquaintance.
"I must ask you, Sidney, if you'd had any serious quarrel with Alicia just before she left."
"No. Honestly, Mrs. Sneesum." He moistened his lips and raised his hands from his knees and brought them gently down again. "She wanted to be alone for a while and paint, and she said she'd get in touch with me when she wanted to see me again, or come home. That's why I'm staying here, when I could go to a little town for a change of scene myself. I'd like to be here when she writes or telephones." He was rattling on again, he realized, and he could feel the disbelief his over-explaining had generated. He wondered if they were thinking, "Sidney is staying close to home because he wants to guard the body in the garden. Look how long Christie lived at his place." Sidney shrugged involuntarily and saw Mrs. Sneesum notice it.
"Writers and painters, they think they know it all."
Mrs. Sneesum looked to her husband for support.
"Oh, so do all young people,"
he said, feebly and grumpily.
"They refuse to live the way the rest of society lives, quietly and calmly, taking the ups with the downs, and then they're thrown by the strains their bizarre lives put upon them. You know what I mean, Hartley?"
She looked at him again. But Hartley wasn't saying anything this time, only looking at the carpet, with pursed lips and raised eyebrows.
"In my opinion, the bohemian life has no place in ordinary, everyday society. The people who lead it know they are not behaving the way society means them to behave, means and intends them to behave, and consequently they crack up under their own philosophy because it's false and pretended."
A false god, Sidney thought, as he listened with solemn respect, like someone at a church sermon. Society to Mrs. Sneesham was like some abstract god, very abstract, to whom unquestioning devotion and dedication was due.
"Therefore, Alicia is paying,"
Mrs. Sneesham said heavily, still sitting up straight and looking at Sidney. "Yes," Sidney murmured automatically.
"She was unhappy, naturally."
Mrs. Sneesham looked at Sidney with satisfaction. Upholder of her way of life, of her daughter's natural way of life, which her daughter had gone against. "Yes," Sidney said. They all pondered this in a moment of silent prayer. Then Sidney said, "My neighbour, Mrs. Lilybanks, asked me to ask you both if you'd like to come over for tea around 4. She got to know Alicia quite well. Probably Alicia's mentioned her." Mrs. Sneesham lifted her head quizzically to her husband.
"I don't know, Hartley. What do you think? Of course we should let Mrs. Lilybanks know. Yes, I have heard Alicia speak of her," she added to Sidney.
"Might have to be getting back a little sooner than that,"
Hartley Sneesham put in. Sidney showed them Alicia's room upstairs at Mrs. Sneesham's request, and Mrs. Sneesham commented indifferently and negatively on some of Alicia's latest abstracts. "She did quite a good portrait of Mrs. Lilybanks," Sidney said. "It's downstairs, in the living room. Maybe you didn't notice it." Mrs. Sneesham hadn't, but covered up the fact by saying,
"Oh, yes, I must look at that again."
They left the house at 4:10. On the front walk, Mrs. Sneesham looked toward Mrs. Lilybank's house and said vaguely,
"We might drop in at Mrs. Lilybank's, Hartley, just to meet her, but we mustn't stay for tea."
"No,"
Hartley agreed. They all said goodbye, politely, promised to get in touch at once in case of news, and then Sidney went back into the house. He knew the Sneeshams would stay at Mrs. Lilybank's for at least half an hour, and would certainly accept tea. They had simply eased him out of it so they could speak to Mrs. Lilybanks alone. But since Prissy was there, Sidney thought, there would be a limit to what Mrs. Lilybanks would tell them. He didn't think she would tell them about the carpet, however, whether Prissy was there or not. 15 minutes later, a car motor started and Sidney stood up to see out the window. Prissy's red Triumph was moving off, in the direction of Ipswich and London. 19. Mrs. Lilybanks had been a little surprised to see the Sneeshams without Sidney, and she immediately grasped the import. The first few minutes, while Prissy had been with them, had gone easily enough, but the tension began when Prissy left. The Sneeshams pumped her, slowly, gently, and inexorably. What did she really think of Sidney's and Alicia's bohemian life, of that unkempt front lawn, so bad for the morale, really? Mrs. Lilybanks managed to get a polite smile from the Sneeshams with some of her tolerant replies, but the smiles were brief, and Mrs. Sneesham returned to the attack.
"I never trusted Sidney to make her happy," said Mrs. Sneesham. "The marriage was quite without our whole-hearted approval, you know, but we didn't want to stand in the way like a pair of grim, old-fashioned parents. But we feared the worst, didn't we, Hartley?"
"Yes, we did,"
Hartley Sneesham confirmed.
"Alicia's always thought she wanted her own way, and she's usually had it. She had her own way when she married Sidney. She can go along all right just so far, and then—"
Mrs. Sneesham slapped the back of one hand into the palm of the other.
"She is not capable of strain, whatever she may think. She needs a stable life, the life she was brought up to lead. I didn't care much for Sidney Bartleby when she married him, and I don't like his manner now, quite frankly," said Mrs. Sneesham, looking quite frankly at Mrs. Lilybanks. "What do you mean by his manner now?" asked Mrs. Lilybanks. "He doesn't act like a man whose wife is missing," Mrs. Sneesham asserted. "Not like my idea of the way a husband should react. He's so cool about it. It's as if he knows where she is and isn't saying. But I don't think he does. I don't think he cares, that's what I mean to say. I hope you'll forgive me for speaking so frankly, Mrs. Lilybanks, but this is a serious matter, and we've both been upset for a month. Do you think Alicia and Sidney have some secret agreement they're not letting anybody in on?" Mrs. Lilybanks lifted the teapot to pour more tea, but was met by a small shake of the head from Mrs. Sneesham. "Sidney told me, and so did Alicia, they wanted to be apart for a while." "Yes, I've heard that till I'm quite sick of it. So is Hartley. I meant a more serious agreement, like a divorce." "Oh, certainly not that I know of," Mrs. Lilybanks said. "But then Alicia wouldn't have told me of anything like that, I think." "She never mentioned any other man?" asked Mrs. Sneesham. "No, indeed. We have to think of all sorts of unpleasant possibilities," Mrs. Sneesham said. Then after a pause, "even that Sidney might have killed her." Mrs. Lilybanks looked at Mrs. Sneesham, who was watching her, plainly to see if the same idea had occurred to her. Mr. Sneesham showed no reaction, so he and his wife must have talked about this before. "Has that crossed your mind?" asked Mrs. Sneesham.
"Clarissa," said
Mr. Sneesham gently,
"don't let your imagination run away with you."
"Look at the facts," said his wife with grim calm. "The police haven't found Alicia in Brighton or anywhere else. She hasn't come forth, though her pictures were in every newspaper in England more than a week ago. Sidney Bartleby never had a bean in his life, and he stands to gain a good deal if Alicia's dead."
"Really, my dear, it's too much like a detective story."
"That's what they all say until it's too late," his wife replied. "I think it's time for a good detective myself." She waited for Mrs. Lilybanks to say something. Mrs. Lilybanks could not speak, and several seconds passed. "I hope you can feel free and will be honest enough to tell me if you suspect Sidney of any foul play, Mrs. Lilybanks. If you've noticed anything, even a quarrel they had." Mrs. Lilybanks could see the tears in Alicia's mother's eyes. She felt kindly toward her then, as she had not before. "I'm sure they had their small quarrels, like any other married couple." "You sound as if you saw some. When?"
"Oh,"
Mrs. Lilybanks floundered,
"a raised voice in the kitchen one night when I was there for dinner. It was nothing. It lasted a second. I'm sure every couple does it."
"Whose voice?"
"Sidney's. It was only for an instant."
Mrs. Sneesham did not appear satisfied with this. "And a quarrel just before Alicia left?"
"No, I certainly didn't hear of any," Mrs. Lilybanks replied.
"Did you ever see him strike her?" asked Mrs. Sneesham.
"Oh, dear, no."
"So you like Sidney?" Mrs. Lilybanks took a breath and said carefully, "I find him interesting, and very amusing sometimes. He's full of ideas, for stories that he can't sell."
"Well, there's some hope about his Whip series. Didn't he mention it? That television plays?"
"Oh." Mrs. Sneesham glanced at her husband, who showed no interest in this information. "I suppose he's doing them with Alex Polk Faraday."
"Yes, I think he is," said Mrs. Lilybanks.
"There's a nice young man. Not too proud to take a job, even if he does want to be a writer." Mrs. Lilybanks said nothing, and felt her liking for Mrs. Sneesham ebb again. But shouldn't she, in all fairness, tell her about the carpet incident, she wondered? It would be breaking her promise to Sidney, but wasn't it cowardly to withhold information just for fear of being hated by a guilty man? Or called a troublemaker by an innocent one? If Mrs. Sneesham hadn't been such an emotional type, Mrs. Lilybanks might have told the Sneeshams, cautioning them to speak quietly to the police about it, to present the facts, blurred as they were by the dawn light and her own failing eyes, and let the police do the rest. But Mrs. Lilybanks knew she could not trust Mrs. Sneesham to do it coolly. "So you like Sidney?" Mrs. Sneesham said.
"My dear, I don't think you should quiz our hostess so thoroughly," said Mr. Sneesham, coming down on the last word. The Sneeshams got up a few moments later and took their leave, thanking Mrs. Lilybanks for her tea. Mrs. Lilybanks was touched by the fact Mrs. Sneesham had an impulse to kiss her on the cheek, and
just restrained herself. Even Mr. Sneesham held her hand warmly in both of his for an instant.
"Alicia speaks so well of you," Mr. Sneesham said. "She's very fond of you."
"That's why I think it's strange she hasn't written to her, dear," said Mrs. Sneesham.
They went out to their car, which was near Sidney's front door. Mrs. Lillybanks put away the tea things, put the dishes in the sink ready for washing, then forced herself to the telephone. She had come to a decision while talking to the Sneeshams and didn't want to backslide about it. She called the police in Ipswich and asked to speak to Inspector Brockway. Inspector Brockway was not in.
"I have something to tell him that I think may be of importance," she said. "It's about Alicia Bartleby."
"Yes? Well, can I take the message for you, Mrs. Lillybanks?"
"No, thank you. I don't want to give it over the telephone. I'd like to speak to the inspector in person."
They said they could get a message to him by 7 p.m, and if he were not able to come to her house then, they would ask him to ring her. Mrs. Lillybanks told them she would be in all evening. When she hung up, she realized that in order to tell the whole truth, she would have to tell Inspector Brockway about the sudden uproar from Sidney the evening Alicia dropped a glass. It may have ended there, but it certainly showed that Sidney had some violence in him. Alicia had told her of 2 occasions when Sidney had struck her.
"Sidney can get into an absolute fury, just like that," Alicia had said, and snapped her finger.
It had crossed Mrs. Lillybanks' mind that Alicia might be off on some spree of her own, perhaps even with a man friend, by way of bolstering her ego and getting back at Sidney. After the visit from the Sneeshams, this somehow seemed less likely to Mrs. Lillybanks, and it seemed more likely that Sidney had gone too far in one of his tempers. Inspector Brockway had asked her what she thought of Sidney's character, or rather his temperament. She could imagine Sidney angry enough to kill someone, and imagine him cool enough afterward to carry it off, at least as well as he was carrying it off now. Inspector Brockway rang at 7:20 and came to Mrs. Lillybanks' house at 9:15. From Mrs. Lillybanks' house he went next door to speak to Sidney Bartleby.